anybody's so inclined and you want to actually gather in the central section, you don't have to, but kind of nice.
Good evening. My name's Bob Gallish. I'm a parishioner here at St. Michael's and also part of a group called Ignited by Truth. Hopefully you know of the Ignited by Truth team. They put on a yearly conference. The next one's going to be April 18th at Reynolds Arena of next year. And one of the things that the conferences include are some great speakers. So Melissa was a speaker at the conference 3 years ago. And we received such great feedback, and it's such an important story. So we're thrilled to be coupling or working with Respect Life Committee here at St. Michael's. Can you hear me? You can't hear me? Oh, sorry. We're thrilled to be working louder. Did you hear any of it? Should I start again? Okay. If you're patient, I'll try it one more time. Hello. Hello. My name's Bob Gallish, and I'm a parishioner here at St. Michael's. And I'm also a member of a group called Ignited by Truth, which puts on a yearly conference here in Raleigh. So that yearly conference is going to be April 18th of 2020, or April 18th of next year. And one of the things that they do at the conference is we bring in some wonderful speakers. So Melissa was a speaker there 3 years ago. So, she was so impressive, and it's such an important topic. So we're thrilled to be able to partner with the Respect Life Committee here and with the permission or support of Monsignor Doug to have Melissa come and talk to you tonight. So thank you for staying on a Sunday night. I think you'll find it tremendously worthwhile. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is Eileen Mayhew, and on behalf of the Respect Life Committee here at St. Michael the Archangel, I want to thank you for spending part of your Sunday night with us. What you will hear from our guest speaker in a few minutes is the kind of wonderfully compelling witness that can change the world if we let it move our hearts and minds. But before we turn attentively to Melissa Ohden, let's pause to acknowledge that she is not here by accident. She is here in part because she is welcome here. Those of us on the Respect Life Committee are all volunteers. We meet once a month in the evening for about an hour, and we're passionate about celebrating the full spectrum of human life, from conception through natural death. If you've thought about participating in one of our events, we're glad, and we encourage you to take the next step. Help us put transportation together for the March for Life in Washington, D.C. Help us sponsor the Baby Bottle fundraiser that saves babies and mommies by raising money for Birth Choice of Wake County. Help us decorate the parish campus with landscape flags to remember the most vulnerable victims of abortion every October. Help us pray. Help us write supportive letters to people who feel trapped by the abortion industry and are looking for a way out. We're pleased to be able to say that we're an active group, even compared to other Catholic parishes, but there aren't many of us. We want to welcome you to the pro-life cause in whatever way you want to serve. We're doing our best to follow the Savior who told us that he came that we might have life to the full. And it's when we band together in celebration of human life that we come to the attention of wonderful speakers like the woman I'm honored to introduce tonight. Melissa is the survivor of a failed saline infusion abortion. Believing she was less than 5 months pregnant with Melissa in 1977, her birth mother attempted to abort her. Miraculously, the abortion did not succeed in ending Melissa's life. Although the doctors initially believed that she would not live past her infancy, and if she did, she would suffer from multiple disabilities throughout her lifetime. She was adopted into a loving home as an infant, and she not only survived, but thrived. As Melissa will be sharing with us her life, her story is so much more than one of survival. Melissa's testimony speaks to the beauty of God's grace in our lives, about the power of love, about hope, and healing in the midst of grief and loss, about the transformational power of forgiveness, and in answering God's call for your life. Melissa's perspective as an abortion survivor who has contact with numerous members of her biological family and as a mother herself, highlights the intergenerational impact of abortion on families and communities. Fulfilling the purpose that she believes God set out for her when he saved her from the certain death of the abortion attempt, Melissa is truly a voice for the voiceless. I'd like to present to you our speaker, Melissa Ohden.
And here I hug people and forget I have a microphone on. So if you all didn't hear that, I was telling her what an honor it is for me to be here. And it truly is. I know that people have a lot of questions when you know that this speaker is coming in to talk about pro-life issues. I know that when people hear the words abortion survivor, some people get very nervous because abortion is one of those topics that is so difficult for our society to face. Even though we live in a society that has been forever transformed by legalized abortion, the reality is that as a culture, we have been forever changed by it. However, in the midst of being changed by it, there is still so much discomfort. Discomfort because abortion is not a pretty thing to think about, a pretty thing to talk about. We, probably each and every one of us in this room, know someone who has had an abortion, and we want them to know that they're loved, that they're forgiven. And so we live in a society that often doesn't talk about abortion. And let's be really honest, when we do, it's not always a very civilized discussion, is it? And I hope that we can take away from tonight that we are called to have this discussion in our churches, in our families, in our marriages, in our friendships. And yes, we are called to have these discussions even in the public arena, but to do so with love and grace. And I know this year has been difficult, not only in North Carolina, but truly across our nation. And God has put me in a really interesting position in my life. I want people to know the truth about life. I want people to know that they are loved and forgiven. But God has also called me forward to live a public life and to fight for life when not many people have the opportunity to live in my shoes. And so you will catch, of course, as I speak tonight, I have a lot of different experiences that I can bring to the table. But I am so grateful that God has blessed me with this life. And if anybody follows me on social media, you may have noticed that I posted something kind of interesting last night. And it fits so beautifully with this weekend's gospel reading. I posted that I was having a hard time leaving home. Motherhood is also my vocation, my primary vocation. We have a 5-year-old and an 11-year-old. And this time of year, I travel very frequently, and our 5-year-old was not happy about that, right? And also, she wasn't feeling well this week, so of course I had this weeping little girl who didn't want mommy to leave, and suddenly I was questioning myself, thinking, you know what, Melissa? Maybe you say yes one too many times. You say your family comes first, do they? And I was doubting myself. And I left the house kind of biting my lip, right? Trying to hold back my tears. And all of a sudden I glanced up at the sky. And jet trails had created crosses all across the sky. And of course, as you hear in my voice, I started to cry. And I laughed. I laughed probably even more than I cried, because as much as I wanted to question God as I left the house yesterday, right, wanted to say, could I do things maybe on my terms, on my timetable, Lord, not when you call me? He showed me, right, that he's there in every single detail. And we are called to simply say yes. And of course, in the midst of me saying yes, I've been so blessed to be here this weekend. And every time I call home, guess what? They're all okay. Believe it or not, they're all okay. And I think they're better than okay. They're great. They watched football today. They were eating hot dogs. I mean, seriously, they were all okay. And I share that with you because no matter if it's pro-life ministry or something else that you are being called to in this life and you are thinking, oh, Lord, please don't call me. Or maybe let me do this my own way. Simply say yes. That fiat is everything, as we know. And truly, my first fiat began through someone else's no, 42 years ago. I can age myself very quickly. Some of you are doing the math already, right? I was born in 1977. It's okay. I know some of you ran the numbers. It happens a lot. I made the mistake once of asking a youth group. It wasn't in North Carolina. The state will be left nameless, but it wasn't North Carolina. But I made the mistakes years ago at a youth group, and I said, hey guys, I survived an abortion in 1977. How old am I? Don't ever leave that up to a group of young people. No offense. Probably no one. Don't ever leave the math in a time of duress, right, to other people. They did the math, and I was 88 years old, and that was a number of years ago. So clearly I have aged some since then. So I'm 42, not 88. A little minor detail we can all get out of the way, right? But it was 42 years ago, in not a laughing matter, that my biological mother found herself facing her unplanned pregnancy with me. And what I know about my birth mother is that really she fits most statistics when it comes to abortion still today. My birth mother was 19 years old. She was a college student. She wasn't married to my biological father yet. And sadly, one of the greatest statistics she fits is one that isn't often talked about in our society, and that's coercion. It's such an interesting thing, isn't it? We live in a society that talks about abortion as a choice and as a woman's right. But if you peel back those words and you listen to women's experiences, if you read the research, what you will find is that very few women have any choice when it comes to abortion. The Elliott Institute actually reports that well over 60% of women identify feeling pressured into their abortion. There was another statistic put out earlier this year, and I think it was Dr. Lanfranchi who put this one out. I saw National Right to Life reported it. She had reported that 42% of women identified being coerced. Isn't that an interesting set of statistics in our culture that wants to somehow tout this as a right and something that people want to celebrate? We truly have to listen to the voices of women who have been coerced into their abortions and pick up on those key words. They may not use the word coercion, but you'll often hear words like, I felt like I had no other choice. They told me I would have nowhere to live. I've even met young men who have said, Melissa, if we don't go through with that abortion, my parents are going to kick me out of the house. And who am I to defy them when they've done so much for me? Coercion and pressure is so very real for women in particular. You know, as sad as that reality of coercion is, the saddest reality for me now comes in knowing that it was taken even one step further in my birth mother's life. I spent years, first of all, believing that it was her choice to have the abortion. Then, as I started to learn more about her, I suspected that she was coerced. Unfortunately, what I've learned in recent years is that it was actually forced upon her against her will. Like many women in that position, it was members of her own family who made that decision for her. I know this is the difficult part for many people to hear. It was my grandmother who was responsible for forcing that abortion. My maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse in their community of Sioux City, Iowa. I know in her heart my grandmother knew the scientific and the biblical basis for when life begins, but she also knew how to make a secret forced abortion take place on her own daughter, bypassing hospital regulations and procedures at the time, with the help of her friend and colleague, the local abortionist. From what I've been told, he owed her a really big favor. That really big favor was meant to lead to my death. That type of abortion procedure that was forced upon my birth mother was the most common one performed back in the 1970s, the saline infusion abortion. It's not performed routinely anymore, quite simply because too many of us lived. Too many of us survived that procedure. And that's why the abortion industry has gone on to find much more effective ways to make sure that people like me don't come into this world. And you could look it up. You can read words like the dreaded complication of abortion. The abortion industry themselves admitted this decades ago. But that saline infusion abortion that was forced upon my birth mother involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald me to death. If the child was fortunate enough, usually their life was ended within the first 24 hours. They would be scalded and poisoned to death. And then premature labor was induced with the intent of that deceased child being expelled from the womb. So all in all, the procedure usually lasted about 72 hours. We actually know through my own medical records that I didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for 24 hours or 3 days. I actually soaked in it for 5. 5 days. 2 days longer than even the standards of that abortion procedure, quite simply because they could not succeed in inducing my birth mother's labor. They tried time and time again over that 5-day period. And as you can gather, I'm a little stubborn, right? We can all laugh about this now. I truly believe that God gave me that gift, right? Knowing that that is a gift that I needed in this world. But back then I was stubborn, I wasn't budging, and I continued to soak in that toxic salt solution. On the 5th day of the abortion procedure, they finally succeeded in inducing her labor. And I was delivered in the final step of that abortion procedure, believing that I would be a successful abortion, otherwise known as a deceased child. Can you imagine the shock that went through the hospital room that day when I was accidentally born alive? We know that there were many, many children like me through that procedure who were ultimately born alive. But sadly, so many of them were not provided medical care. We've been having this conversation as a culture in the last year in particular, and I know it makes people very uncomfortable, but we have to face the reality that not all children who survive abortions are provided medical care. And I can say that to you because I'm one of them. When I survived that failed abortion, I now know that there were demands made to leave me in that hospital room to die. My parents were told that it was the abortionist who gave that demand. Sadly, I've learned in recent years that it was not the abortionist. It was someone much closer to me, my grandmother. Not only did she force that abortion upon my birth mother, but she heavily monitored that procedure. And coming face to face, even accidentally, with her firstborn grandchild that day, she is the one who demanded that I be left to die. And I don't fault her for that. This is what abortion has done to our culture. People now make life and death decisions about lives like mine every single day, regardless of their relationship. And I share that with you not for anyone to judge her or condemn her. I share that with you because I think there's a powerful lesson to be learned there. No matter what decisions my grandmother made about my life, no matter what else I could ever find out about her, I love her unconditionally, the way we are called to love other people, even those who set out to harm us, knowing she could probably never love me in return. I love her as a fellow broken human being. And I know some people hear that and go, how could you ever? And I say, how could I not? How could I not? After everything the Lord has done for me, how could I not do what he has called me to do, which is to love and to forgive? And I am so thankful that no matter what decision she was making about my life that day at the hospital, there were actually nurses on staff who defied her very orders. My parents had heard about two nurses in particular over the years that had fought for me. And I was so blessed after my book was published about almost 3 years ago now. A nurse actually contacted me directly and was able to share more of the story. She wasn't the nurse who was there in the room when I was delivered alive, but she was a nurse working in the neonatal intensive care unit that day when one tall, blonde nurse rushed me in because, in her words, she was not willing to leave me there to die. My fate rested in the hands that day of who was working. And even though I'm so grateful to God for that, the reality is no child should ever have to have their life placed in the hands of their abortionist or a nurse who is on staff that day. I truly believe I'm one of the most blessed people in the world because those nurses had their own fiat. They said, yes, yes, Lord, we're going to save this one. Yes, Lord, we see her and we will do what it takes. I truly believe that's why I'm alive today, is because other people said yes. And you would never know by looking at me tonight, right? That I should have been poisoned and scalded to death in the womb. You would never know by looking at me that when I was rushed off to the NICU that day by the nurse, the prognosis for my life was very poor. When I was delivered alive in that abortion procedure, I weighed a little less than 3 pounds. I weighed 2 pounds, 14 ounces, which indicated to the medical professionals that my birth mother was much further along in her pregnancy than the 18 to 20 weeks that the abortionist had written on my medical records. And in fact, when a neonatologist finally examined me, he remarked, he estimated me to be about 31 weeks. 31 weeks gestational age. And we know babies who survive premature births much earlier than 31 weeks. But this is also a really important piece to remember, because we also live in a society right now that somehow wants to say, I'm an outlier in this conversation. I've actually been told she is not relevant. I'm going to be relevant to my last breath, fortunately or unfortunately. I'm going to be relevant. But people will say, right, well, that procedure isn't performed anymore, so she's not relevant. It's not relevant because, she was a late-term abortion. That doesn't happen. Did anyone happen to see that the Guttmacher Institute reported out earlier this year that 32% of late-term abortions take place because women aren't sure how far along in the pregnancy they are? It happens. But do we talk about it? That's the big question, isn't it? So here I was, 31 weeks gestational age, when I was whisked off to the NICU. I suffered from severe respiratory and liver problems. I suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. The doctors actually thought I had a fatal heart defect initially because of the amount of distress I was under. It didn't take them long to realize structurally there was nothing wrong with my heart. It was simply what that abortion procedure had done to my body. But as you heard in my introduction, they were very guarded about what my future might hold. And I think when sometimes people hear even those parts, right, this baby may not live, this baby is likely going to suffer from multiple disabilities, we still live in a culture that says, maybe that's a life not worth living. Who could ever love a child like that? But we know the answers to those questions. Every life is worth living, and every child is loved. My adoptive parents did not hesitate for a second to open their hearts and their home to me. I can honestly say my parents didn't have really a penny to their name. I'm from the Midwest. I live in Kansas City now, but I grew up in Iowa. My parents were farmers who lost their farm in the farm crisis of the 1980s. So they were so close already to losing their farm when they received the phone call about this little girl who had survived an abortion, was likely going to need great care. But they knew they were called to be my parents. And they said yes. Their fiat. They said yes without hesitation. And I can tell you, even if they didn't have a penny to their name, my parents had everything that I needed. And that was love. I'm a convert to the Catholic Church. My priest and I joke, he says, Melissa, you have the heart of a Catholic and the mouth of a Protestant. And over the years I said, pray for me, Father, that I can get those two things lined up. And he always says, Melissa, you are exactly how God created you to be. But my mouth of a Protestant comes from my mom and dad. But my joke with my parents is that they're really Catholics and they don't know it, even yet. My parents did such a beautiful job of raising my older sister. We're both adopted. They raised us to know about love and mercy. They raised us to know that our biological parents loved us so much that they gave us the gift of life and our family when they couldn't care for us. That is the stage that my parents set for me, and I'm forever grateful for that, because I truly believe that's what has allowed me to go forth in this world and heal and do well. But what my parents didn't tell me, of course, was that there is a whole other story behind my adoption. Like many parents in that position, they kept it a secret. They were afraid of how the truth about my survival might impact my life, how it might impact the way I felt about my biological parents. And so they kept it a secret. But when I was 14 years old, the truth about my survival came tumbling out unexpectedly. A very unplanned and unexpected kind of thing happened at the age of 14. My older sister, as a high school student, faced her own unplanned pregnancy. And it happens, doesn't it? I call these the when the rubber hits the road moments, right? We can be raised with very firm beliefs about life and the gift of adoption, but when the rubber hits the road and choices have to be made, the reality is there are a couple of different paths that can be taken. In my sister's case, she was considering every path, which included abortion. When our parents found out that she was facing that unplanned pregnancy and was still considering all of her options, they decided to do something very important. they told her the story of my survival, hoping that she would understand just how big of a decision she was facing in her life. So that was almost 28 years ago now that my sister was told the story of my survival. My youngest nephew just turned, oldest nephew turned 27 earlier this summer. She carried him, she parented him, went on and had other children. Was it always easy for her? No, it's not ever easy. But I love that in the midst of that, it allowed us to see God's grace. It allowed our family to put our pro-life words and thoughts in action. And I love that. Father talked a little bit about that tonight. I don't know if anybody else caught that, but he was saying it's so important, right, to do more. It's important to get involved. And my family got to get involved that time. It may not have been what we expected it to be. It may not have been what my parents initially wanted to see her living out in her life. But my parents learned to find great joy in serving her and serving my nephew as they continued to grow and thrive. But the reason why I found out the story of my survival was because after my sister found out the story, like any good teenage sister, some of you sense where this is going, right? Downhill very quickly, yes. Like any good teenage sister, she didn't keep it a secret from me. She didn't tell me everything, but it was actually during an argument about something. I don't even know what it was. But one night we were arguing like teenage sisters could do. And in the middle of this argument, she said something that had never been said before. She said, "You know, Melissa, at least my biological parents wanted me." That's what I was thinking too, right? What a low blow. And what is that about, right? That's what my 14-year-old brain is thinking. What is this about? I thought we were equally loved. I thought we were equally placed for adoption. I thought we were equally wanted. Why would anybody say something like this? And I turned on my heel to say something back to her that night, and the look on her face fell immediately. And that's when she realized she had said something that she wasn't supposed to. She got to me quicker than my parents could. And so that night, all she did was say, "You know, just wait up for mom and dad tonight. Ask them to tell you the truth, and you will see." And lots of people ask me in hindsight, "You know, Melissa, didn't you ever see news like this coming? Didn't you ever feel different growing up?" No, I didn't feel different growing up. I thought I was just like everyone else. And no, I never could have seen the news coming. Missy, your biological mother, had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it. When my mom spoke those words that night, I was absolutely devastated. It was just as painful and terrible as my parents were afraid it was going to be. And I can tell you in that moment of time that I heard those words, I knew God spared my life. I knew he had a purpose and a plan for me. But I think sometimes it's really hard to embrace your purpose when you're in the midst of great pain. And I was in pain that night. I was in pain for so many nights after that as I grappled with the truth about what had happened to me and how my life would be forever changed. I'll admit I didn't want to be this person years ago. You know, it's almost embarrassing to say that out loud now, but I think people can understand, right? At the age of 14 and all those years ago, not only did we not talk about abortion, but we didn't talk about abortion survivors. I spent years of my life believing that I must be the only one. And so it was a very lonely existence for me. And to be 14 years old, I did just want to be like everyone else. Now I can't imagine being anybody but who God created me to be. But in the midst of my own pain, of course, I suffered. And as human beings, we create our own suffering from time to time, don't we? I suffered with an eating disorder, trying to control something in my life when I couldn't control about how I came into this world. I struggled with alcohol abuse because I wanted to numb all of those feelings that I had inside. I struggled with so many more choices because I simply wanted to escape from my reality. And I share that with you because I know I'm not alone in this. All of us have something that we want to run away from. And the only person who can heal us is Jesus. And I'm living proof of that. You know, people often ask me, Melissa, how did you ever start out on that journey to feel better, do better, not be in that place of suffering anymore? And it is simply Jesus. And waking up every single day and saying, why am I doing this to myself? Doesn't he want more for me than this? He wants more for me than what I am allowing myself. Even at the age of 14, I could straighten that out pretty easily. And so God healed me and set me forth on this journey to someday share his story with the world. But before I ever came forward publicly, I wanted to achieve a couple of things. I wanted to find my biological parents because I wanted them to know firsthand that I'm alive and well, not angry, not bitter. And I wanted to try and obtain my medical records. I didn't know back then that most abortion survivors will never have their medical records because the abortion industry and others have not wanted us to have them. You know, it's so interesting. If you look up these words, dreaded complication, you'll find that there was a doctor associated with the CDC, Dr. Willard Cates, who years ago talked about survivors' medical records. And as he was talking about it, you can find the full quote, but essentially what he said was this: they are afraid of public clamor when it comes to abortion survivors. They're afraid of how the public will respond if they talk about it or document it. He said, it's kind of like, why would you report yourself to the IRS for an audit? So now we live in a world where abortion survivor stories are not often heard, not only because we experience shame, because many survivors are keeping family secrets, but also because so many survivors don't have any record of what was done to them. Most of the time it's passed on through family. Most of the survivors that I've connected with, I'm the founder of a group called the Abortion Survivors Network. We've now connected with over 300 abortion survivors. But we know statistically the number is much higher. But of those abortion survivors, the majority are raised in their biological family after the abortion occurs. That's not what you expect to hear, is it? But think about this for a minute. The child is not the problem. The child is not the problem. Whatever crisis that family is experiencing, whatever that woman is going through, that is the problem. And so when the child is accidentally born alive, it makes great sense that that child is brought into the family because they weren't the problem. Back then, I didn't know all of these little details. What I knew is that if I ever came forward with my story, my medical records would be really important. And it took me over 10 years of searching to find them. It took me over 10 years of searching to find my biological parents. You know, during those 10 years of searching, I think most people probably thought I led this really perfect life. I obtained my master's degree in social work. I married my husband. Lots of people have questions about him. He's actually pretty normal, you guys, believe it or not. We can joke about this, right? My husband and I have been called to live a very public life, but I can't imagine doing any of it without him. But people thought we led a pretty normal life, right? I have a master's degree in social work. I married my husband. What people didn't realize is that during those 10 years of searching, I was desperately discerning God's will for me. I cannot tell you how many times I prayed, Lord, if this is your will, let it be done. But how many years do you pray that prayer and stay faithful? I can honestly tell you there were times during those 10 years where I went, I've got to stop doing this, right? I've got to just try to lead this normal life because how much longer can I keep waiting? How many more times can I pray this prayer? And finally in 2007, because it was God's timing, I finally obtained my medical records. You can see them in my book. You can see them on the internet. You can see them when I've testified before Congress. I am not afraid of the truth about my life. In my medical records, they say things like a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. Isn't that an interesting statement in a world that doesn't often want to talk about what abortion really is? In another portion of my medical records, it actually lists out a complication of pregnancy for my birth mother as that saline infusion abortion. I think truer words have probably never been spoken. It certainly complicated things for her and for me. And as hard as it was to read through those medical records, I ultimately experienced great joy. Because not only did I get to read about how those medical professionals had intervened to save my life, but I was also able to learn who my biological parents are. After 10 years of searching, and trust me, I'm pretty good at this searching thing. I now do this with other abortion survivors and even adoptees or people who are just looking for someone. After 10 years of searching and doing things my way, I had a lot of pieces to that puzzle, but I did not have my biological parents' names. But when they sent me those medical records in one little tiny corner, they forgot to black them out. We would call that a HIPAA violation in today's world, right? Probably one of the bigger ones that I've ever known about. I don't call that a HIPAA violation, though, and I hope that you don't either. I call that divine intervention, because that is the Lord once again, right? Reminding me that He is in charge of every little detail. Not me, but Him. And of course, that night I started searching to see if I could determine where my biological parents were living. You're never going to guess what I discovered. I was living in the very same city as my biological father. I grew up knowing my birth mother's abortion had taken place in Sioux City, Iowa. During my years of searching, I moved there to finish my master's degree, never thinking for a second that I had biological family there. If you know that area of the country at all, that little city sits on the border of Nebraska and South Dakota. And so I thought chances were pretty good that maybe they had traveled across state lines to even have that abortion. But there he was. And I prayed about it for many months before I finally did what I knew God was calling me to do. And that was to reach out to him. I sent my birth father a letter to his office and not his home. That was my way of trying to protect him a little bit, not knowing if he had ever told his family about me. So I sent him a letter to his office in 2007, letting him know all the things I've told you all tonight, right? I know the truth. I'm alive. I'm well. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm so blessed. And of course I said, here we are, living in the very same city. If you ever want to connect or have a relationship with me, I'll be waiting to hear from you. Do you think I ever heard back from him? I never did. It's been over 12 years now. And those were some difficult days early on also, because I desperately wanted to hear from him. And of course, the enemy has this way of sneaking in, right? And convincing us, whispering in our ear. Brought back all the things I had been told long ago, right? You are unloved. You are unworthy. No one will ever want to hear from you. But you choose to trust in God once again. And I got to see God's hand working day in and day out, because I had to learn to live in peace with never hearing from my biological father. And so I searched for my biological mother then. I couldn't find my birth mother through my searching, but I found her parents very quickly. You know that grandmother that I told you all about? Anybody else do things in their life and look back on it and go, wow, I can't believe I did that? If you ask my husband probably what it's like to be married to me, he would probably say that, right? Like every day I have no idea what she's going to do. But in every good way, right? And we call those the Holy Spirit inspired moments where you just go forth and you do. And then later you don't really ask questions except like, did that really just happen? That's usually how that's lived out at our house. But, you know, looking back on it, part of me can't believe I sent my grandparents a letter, because I didn't know that my grandmother played that huge role in the abortion taking place. But the greater part of me looks back upon that and says, Melissa, man, I am sure grateful that the Lord led you to do that, because they probably needed to hear from you just as much as your biological mother. I was never expecting any kind of reply. I had never heard from my birth father, so why would I expect any kind of reply from them? But my grandfather did just that, within days of me sending them a letter. In his letter, my grandfather admitted that he knew that I knew my live birth was not the intention that day at the hospital. I think that was really courageous of him given the circumstances. But he went on and told me some things about my birth mother and their family, and I want to share a couple of those points with you, because they aren't just the story of our lives. They're the story of many people's lives when it comes to abortion. The first point my grandfather shared is that my birth mother had never told anyone about her abortion. And I know she's not alone in that. I would suspect there are people here tonight who have an abortion in their past who have never talked about it. And I hope you hear me saying you are loved, you are forgiven. I want you to know that there are places to go here in our community, in your community, that can support you in your healing. Whether it's Project Rachel, Rachel's Vineyard, a local pregnancy center, there are so many opportunities for people to find healing. And I truly believe that that is the most important thing we can do to build a culture of life in our world, is to first of all heal from our own pain of abortion. But my grandfather closed his letter with a final point, and it's kind of an interesting one. He closed his letter by letting me know my messages would not be passed along to my birth mother, because in reality they were completely estranged. No communication, no relationship. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it years ago, but I understand it now. Now that I know the whole dynamics of that forced abortion, I understand it, and I'm sure you do too. Knowing what they were responsible for, it makes incredible sense that their relationship has been forever changed. But I share that with you because this is also a dynamic that's played out in our families still today. Abortion changes families. It impacts relationships, unless there is healing that ultimately occurs. And that's why healing, again, is so very important, because it doesn't just affect one person. It affects entire families for generations. And that is the last time I heard from my grandparents was well over 12 years ago now. I learned to once again live in peace, knowing that I may never hear from my biological mother. But that's also when I came forward publicly as a survivor for the first time. The very first time I spoke publicly was on Capitol Hill, because that's a really friendly place for someone like me with a story like this, right? Ugh, I should have known there would likely be a whole lot more to come from that. But I'll be honest, the very first time I spoke, I was out there thinking, oh, Lord, thank you for this opportunity, but I'm never going to do this again. Brutally honest, right? Brutally honest. I am never going to do this again. I went home and I told my husband, yeah, that was great. I love Jesus, but I am not a public speaker. But I am. That whole obedience thing is pretty important, isn't it? But that very first time I was saying, oh yeah, no, I'm not a public speaker. I told my husband, oh, I was so sick to my stomach. I'm just a bundle of nerves. What we learned within a few short days after that is that it wasn't a bad case of nerves from speaking that was making me sick. It was a horrible case of morning sickness with our oldest daughter. God has this funny way of humbling us, right? And I love that, as I want to tell him, no, I'm not a public speaker. And he's going, hey, hold on a minute. It's just morning sickness. You're going to be just fine. And by the way, there's probably 9 more months of that to go. But it was during my pregnancy with Olivia that I started to loosen my grip on my vocation as a social worker, to accept the calling that I know God set out for me. And I share that with you because I know we all have something that we don't want to give up. You know, we talk about obedience, we talk about what a blessing it is to follow and serve God, but if we're brutally honest, I think we all have something that we would rather keep. And for me, my career was something that I wanted to keep. I experienced incredible joy in it. And of course, when people heard that I was starting to speak publicly, they would say, why would you do that? Nobody wants to hear about abortion. And why would you leave this great job in state government for what? What are the benefits like? Well, the benefits are eternal, for starters, right? But there were all these misconceptions, but that's when I started to loosen my grip on my career as a social worker to accept my vocation in pro-life ministry. What I didn't know is that as I was starting to travel the world in defense of life, my birth father was actually home fighting for his. That's why he never replied to my letter, because he passed away about 6 months after I sent it to him. And he died almost to the very day of the Roe versus Wade anniversary. And I know that is not a coincidence. His life was forever impacted by that abortion, as so many men's lives are. But I didn't know about it for a period of time that he had passed away. My husband, of course, was saving newspapers for me, and it seems like such a small little thing, but he asked me one day as I was traveling, he said, "Melissa, should I keep keeping these papers for you?" And I said, "No, just get rid of them, right? By the time I get home, no, it won't be relevant." Well, God in his wisdom knew that if I kept those papers, I was going to find something. My biological father's obituary. I ended up stumbling across it months later because I Googled his name on the internet. That was my way of staying connected to him when I had never heard back from him. And that last time I Googled his name, it was his obituary. And I can tell you that I questioned God that night, how that could be the plan. And I think it's easy to trust in God's will when things go the way we want them to, or maybe the way we plan it to. But it's a whole other thing to trust in his will when things happen otherwise. And I questioned God that night. 10 years of searching for him to find him and be in the same city? How could this ever be your plan? And I can tell you, he spoke loud and clear back to me that night. He said, "Be patient, Melissa. My plan is much greater than the one you had in mind." And it's always true. As the months unfolded, I got to see God's great plan. God's plan actually involved our oldest daughter, Olivia, being born at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, the very same hospital where my life was supposed to end in that abortion. And trust me, I also tried telling him that I wasn't going to do that either. But some things happened, and he made it clear that that was his plan. And once again, I had to choose to say yes. And I am forever grateful, because no matter how much trauma I initially had going through that experience, I can tell you that hospital has been redeemed and restored to a place that is full of life and the most beautiful memories I could ever have. And not long after Olivia was born there, some very important people came into our lives. My biological father's family. When he passed away, his family went to clean out his office, and they found my letter tucked in his top desk drawer. That's how they learned the great secret that he too had kept throughout his life about the abortion. My grandfather and my great aunt entered into our lives. My grandfather is now 91 years old. I think I know where I get a little bit of my stubbornness from. And my grandfather and my great aunt are incredible blessings in our lives. You know, I wish I could tell you that I was connected with all of my birth father's family. We lived in the same community for many, many years. But it is solely my grandfather and my great aunt. My grandmother even passed away before she could ever bring herself to meet me, because this is not an easy set of circumstances. There are questions, there is anger, right? There are all of those issues of guilt over what could have been done to make this situation different for all of us. And so even though it's hard for me to see them walk through that, I still have hope, because I know God's not done yet. He's not done working in my birth father's family. He's not done working in my life. He's not done working in yours. But as I close my time with you tonight, I want to share with you my other great source of hope. And that comes from seeing what has happened in my birth mother's family. Even though I haven't heard from my grandparents for many, many years, one of my birth mother's cousins actually reached out to me back in 2013. That cousin was just a teenager when the abortion occurred, but she grew up knowing all about it, and the little girl who had survived. That cousin reached out to me, and that's how I learned that my grandmother was responsible for so many things, that the abortion was forced. That cousin connected me with my two half-sisters on the maternal side of my biological family. and also open the lines of communication with my birth mother. Those were some really difficult conversations for her and I to have, even by email. But there is one big reason why it was so difficult. There was one final great secret about my life that even my adoptive parents didn't know. And that is that my birth mother had spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. It's like something out of a movie, isn't it? A movie that Hollywood would never write. She never knew. We now know that my grandmother went into the neonatal intensive care unit that day and told the nurses to never tell my birth mother that I survived, or they would pay the price for doing so. Members of my birth mother's family all grew up knowing that the abortion had failed and I had lived. But like so many family secrets, this was one that you didn't talk about. She was told when I was delivered that day in the abortion procedure that the abortion had been successful. She was told, "Don't look at it. It's hideous." She didn't know if it was a little boy or a little girl. But what she did know as the years went on is that she lived with incredible regret. If you talk to my birth mother now, she would tell you her greatest regret in life remains that she didn't run away from her parents in an attempt to save me. And my response to her is the same to any other woman. Every woman deserves better than that. No woman should ever have to run away from her family or her partner in order to protect herself or her child. She has nothing to be ashamed of, but I know that she's lived with it. And that's what made it so hard for us to communicate. She questioned how I could ever love her. She questioned how I could ever forgive any of them. And so we spent about 3 years building walls of trust and love with one another before we met face to face for the first time. It's been about 3 years ago now that we met face to face. And it's one of those moments that I know people have a lot of questions about, but it's really hard for me to put into words because it is so sacred. One of those moments where you know God ordained it and you are just blessed to be the small part of it. You know, it's kind of one of those out-of-body experiences where you watch things happening. And I knew every step that I was taking, every time I was getting closer to her. And when we met face to face for the first time, my sister was holding her hand and placed it in mine. And we embraced. And I said, "It's been a long time." What people don't often know is that there was a really important detail about our first meeting. We met face to face for the first time in Kansas City, which, as I shared with you, is where my family and I now live. We moved there back in 2013. That's actually why my birth mother's cousin connected with me at that time. Because there's one really important detail about my birth mother's life that I didn't know. I bet some of you have already started to guess it. My birth mother lives in Kansas City. My birth mother lives in Kansas City. I moved from the city where my biological father and his family was living to the city where my birth mother and even one of my half-sisters lives. No one but God can write this story. But think about how many times along the way, and I've messed it up a handful of times, right? Probably more than a handful of times. How many times it took me saying yes for his plan to continue to unfold. My birth mother is now a huge part of my life. You know, I think I'm one of the most blessed people in the world. My parents, my adoptive parents, are my mom and dad. Period. End of sentence. But my birth mother respects them, loves them, and knows that she also has a place in my life. So my birth mother, my half-sister, all of us get together as frequently as we can. My birth mother is one of my greatest supports. We were actually just in New York City 2 weeks ago, the day before my birthday, filming a series together where you will see her face to face for the first time, talking about what it was like for her to go through that abortion, what her life was like after that, and what it's now been like to have the truth about me being alive and now being a part of our lives. It's going to be something amazing. So keep an eye out for it. But until then, simply know this. My birth mother is grateful that I'm alive. She sees the beauty in what has happened, how things have been redeemed and restored. She questioned God over the years. She said, you know, Melissa, if there is a God, where was he when I needed him that day? And I put space on that for a while with her. I'd listened to her. I had written some scripture in a card for her. And now what I hear her saying is, I know God exists. I know he was there for me. I know that he brought us together. That is the most beautiful and miraculous thing I can ever see happen in my life. And so this is my calling. As much as I've tried to dismiss it over the years or shake it off or find something that felt more comfortable, I can honestly tell you I can't imagine being anybody else but who he made me to be and following him wherever he leads me. And I hope that you find hope in that, because it isn't just me that's called. We are all called to do something to impact our culture, and it starts in our families. It starts in our marriages. But yes, then we also need to do what we're called to do to make a difference in our world. So thank you so much for all you do every single day. And thank you for staying here tonight. I appreciate that.
Do you want to do a Hail Mary now and then questions? I thought it might be nice to close with a prayer because that's such a wonderful story. I thought it'd be nice to close with a prayer since that's a wonderful story. And I think Melissa might answer some questions. So, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. And blessed is the fruit of Jesus. Holy Mary, pray for us sinners.
Deacon, do you have a system on how you want to do this? Pass this around. Okay. All right, Deacon Mark's in charge. I also have mom ears, so I hear things really well.
I'm not sure this is working, actually. You might have to speak really loud.
Hello,
Hi there.
I'm Sarah.
Nice to meet you, Sarah.
Thank you. So I had a conversation today that stopped me in my tracks. I said something about abortion, and they said, oh, we don't discuss politics here. And I wanted to scream. I've heard people say that before. What can I say in response? That is not politics.
It never should have been political. For me, it becomes an easy thing, right? Because I always say, for me, the personal is political. You know? People often say, well, you know, Melissa, can't you just be quiet about that? No, I can't. I'd probably explode. But, you know, I think people need an education. We live in a society that wants to blame, guys, excuse me for this one, but y'all have heard it. They want to blame old white men on trying to restrict abortion currently, right? But what they fail to remember is that it was old white men on the Supreme Court in 1973 who made that call, right? So that's just a little unfortunate fact. So, you know, the reality is that the sanctity of life is a human justice issue. It's a human rights issue. It's not political in that respect. We shouldn't have to have this be a political issue. Life should be protected and respected, and we shouldn't have to have this in the political arena. However, the ruling in 1973 put it there. So I would just simply say it's a human rights issue. It's a social justice issue, because it is. And truly, we are losing more lives to abortion every single day than we are anything else. They still may not like your answer, but it's one that you can give them. I think there's someone back there if you see him. I'm not sure if you do. Thank you.
Thank you for your inspiration and all your talk. I'm pretty sure you put a lot of work in. Thank you very much. Thank God. I want to ask you for the future, our teens, are you conducting clubs where they can be more inactive, where they can spread the word of this from you?
So I'm not sure what you have here in North Carolina, but for instance, my 11-year-old, my 11-year-old could go to Congress and give a couple of speeches. She'd actually do it if I let her, probably at this point. I mean, as you can tell, she's probably cut from the same mold her mother is. But my 11-year-old attends teen camps in the summer already on pro-life issues. So she was actually in Charleston, South Carolina this summer with me. She was at a National Right to Life convention where she received lots of education about life issues. She goes to teen camps. She's been doing that since she was probably 3 years old. And she's enjoying it. So I think it's really important that we get our teens plugged in and let them know not only the truth, but there are other people who believe the same things that they do. Because our culture has this way of trying to make us feel like we are the minority. But what we find, of course, and polling has told us here in the last year that more people identify themselves as pro-life than ever. And so we need to tap teens. Do you guys have anything in particular for teens? Part of your faith formation here? Absolutely. Yeah, it should be a part of every youth group. It should be a part of all of our schools. We're doing some pretty interesting things in the Kansas City community. We have a curriculum, and I think it's called the Huntington curriculum, but we are starting with kindergartners, presenting them with information about the sanctity of life, just in a very age-appropriate way, but setting that stage, right? So they are prepared for that foundation is built for them. But yes, teens are an important part. Thank you for that. Next question. Yeah, over here.
Hi, I'm Diane, and I wanted to thank you. First of all, I was born in 1978, so I knew how we were. Your mom, a 13-year-old mom who gave me up to adoption, and I know it was her pro-life family that saved me. So I kind of know how you feel. Like, it's not okay to be one of the lucky ones.
Yes.
You can't stay quiet.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to hear a little bit more, like people talk about how abortion survivors don't occur anymore because they don't do the saline abortion. Do you have any, like, what are the numbers that you know of that have happened because since they changed the abortion procedure?
Absolutely. That's a great question. First of all, and I'm thankful you're alive. Your mom was very brave. And those are the stories we need to hear too, right? Love is selfless. It is, but we live in a world that somehow says we shouldn't have to be selfless, right? We should just get to do what we want. But we know the truth. Her question was, so knowing that the saline abortion resulted in a high number of live births, and it isn't done routinely anymore, how does that then translate over to our culture today where people are saying, well, okay, so this doesn't happen anymore, so we don't have to worry about this, right? Because they stopped performing that type of abortion procedure. Well, what I can tell you is that there are lots of abortion survivors that exist. There are a handful of us that are public, and we're working on some really big projects. I mean, pray for us. If I could tell you what we're doing right now, your minds would be blown. My mind is a little bit blown about a couple things we're working on. You're going to see us. Trust me, you're going to see us and you're going to hear about us. But there are a handful of survivors that are public. So I'll share with you a little bit about them, and then I'll tell you about some of the folks who exist behind the scenes. So Claire Colwell was here in North Carolina a couple of different times this year. She's a friend of mine. Claire Colwell is a twin abortion survivor. We actually see a pretty high number of twin survivors. What typically happens, and it happened in her case, the abortionist did not perform an ultrasound. Claire just turned 30 this year. So to give you a little bit of a time frame on when they still weren't doing ultrasounds, and they don't always still today, but they didn't perform an ultrasound. Her 13-year-old mother was told that she was pregnant with one child, had a dismemberment abortion, went back to school, and continued to realize, right, that she was experiencing these pregnancy symptoms. Went back to the doctor, found out that there was a second child. It was Claire. The abortionist clean missed her in the womb, and that happens quite frequently. I have the medical record of an abortion survivor out of Texas who has never spoken publicly, but you're going to see her very soon. And in her medical record, they actually talk about that, how they missed her, and that the mother elected not to have another abortion after they realized that she was still there. So twins happen. If you saw me on Fox and Friends a couple times this year, Claire was with me, and then another survivor named Josiah Presley. Josiah also lives in Texas, and he is missing part of his arm because he survived a curettage abortion in Korea. So literally they were slicing him, got part of an arm, and then believed that the abortion had been successful or didn't want to continue on, right? Unfortunately, what I have found through talking with medical doctors is we kind of pour through files. They go, yeah, well, they didn't do a very good job, right? So they actually told Josiah's mom that the abortion had been successful. And of course, in her case too, she continues on and realizes, oh, I'm still pregnant. He's born missing part of an arm. He was placed for adoption after he survived. Some of you may have seen the story of a young man named Nick, N-I-K. The last name is Hoot, H-O-O-T. Nick is now in his early 20s. He's also adopted. He was a wonderful wrestler in high school, but Nick is missing part of his legs. And it's because he survived a dismemberment abortion in Russia. So I was actually just talking with his adopted mom the other day. That abortion occurred at 24 weeks. And he, from what we can tell, speaking with a former abortionist, the body was able to kind of vibrate itself enough that essentially the bleeding stopped at some point. He didn't bleed to death, because you would expect the child to bleed to death. But he didn't bleed to death, and then the amniotic sac, closed back up. It's a complete and total miracle when those kind of things happen. So those are some of the survivor stories you'll see publicly. I can tell you kind of behind the scenes who we see today. We see a lot of children who survive chemical abortions. If you don't know that chemical abortions can be reversed, they can be. That's great information to put out there. But I also know of children who survived both chemical pills. So they went through both chemical pills and the child still lived. So you'll see survivors of chemical abortions. You will see survivors of dismemberment abortions. There's a young lady out of New York who lost an arm a number of years ago. So dismemberment abortions can still result in a live birth. Sometimes labor is simply induced early, believing that the child will not survive. So those are some of the major ones that you'll see. But there was an article put out recently by Live Action, and actually it came out of the David DeLayden case. If anybody follows it, David had done the undercover work about baby body parts. And an abortionist in the middle of a record the other day said, yeah, live births are our greatest nightmare. So it's still a nightmare for them.
We have time for one more question.
All right. Right back there, Deacon Mark. And if anybody has questions afterwards and you have time to stick around, you can still ask me questions. It's okay. I usually have a 5-year-old asking me questions all day.
I'm so glad that you were just talking about the medical part of things, because although I'm not a doctor or nurse, I spent 10 years working in the medical field. And so we've talked, we hear a lot about the political side of things, the legal side of things, social justice, as you brought up, and economic, unfortunately. My lack of understanding when it comes to pro-life and abortion issues is the medical side of all things, even though that's my background, you know. I'm having difficulty understanding where the American Medical Association is. I'm having difficulty understanding how the oversight medically gets through or not through. I'm having difficulty understanding the lack of follow-up care.
Absolutely.
Referrals. I'm having difficulty understanding the situation that you yourself went through without any, like I said, without any.
Right.
Nobody can walk away medically from a patient without it being considered abandonment. If an ER doc leaves an ER, you know, if a nurse walks away from her shift, I don't understand what I don't hear. I don't hear a patient abandonment. I don't hear about referral care. I'm lost in that world. What are you seeing in that respect?
There's actually going to be, and I don't know if it's public yet, so I guess I got to think about what I'm going to say. I can say there's going to be something happening soon in Washington, D.C., where you're going to see a number of medical professionals talking about circumstances like mine, because we need to have medical professionals come forward and share their stories and the honest truth about what they've seen happen. And so you are going to see some of that starting to come out. I mean, more stories told. But I think your point is a very important one. You know, abortion doesn't just end the life of a child most of the time. It is a huge risk to women's health. And when we see the abortion industry and the lobby and unfortunately politicians getting behind that and saying, you know, we can't place any restrictions on abortion, then it provides, you know, it's an undue burden to women, right? And it directly goes against Roe versus Wade. Then what's happening to women? They're at risk. Women are still dying in abortion, right? We heard that that's why abortion was legalized in the first place. What they don't talk about is women are still dying from abortion. Women are still facing medical complications. The abortion lobby and other people still fight basic regulations for the abortion industry. For survivors like me, I have actually testified before Congress a couple of times and said, you know what? Require those abortion clinics to have crash carts. Right? I'm alive because I was at a hospital. If I would have been born alive at a clinic, they wouldn't have the means necessary there to save my life. They wouldn't have had what they needed to provide me medical care. But do you think they want any of those things? They don't. But we're going to keep pushing for them. So the medical part is huge. And again, right, this is when we're all left scratching our heads. We live in a world that talks about science and medicine as being so important, but when it comes to the science of when life begins and the impact of abortion, somehow people want to dodge out of that conversation, right? So keep talking about it.
I want to thank Melissa again for being here tonight with us. I also want to thank, for those of you who are here, I want to thank the folks from IBT who came to us and asked us if we would be willing to host Melissa, Monsignor Doug for allowing this to happen, Father Oji and the other priests for promoting it so well, for our own Respect Life committee that's here. We will continue to try to do everything we can. We do need your support. In the gathering space as you walk out, if you choose, there'll be a couple folks with baskets simply to help support the IBT expenses for Melissa being here. There's no obligation. There's no guilt. You get enough guilt. We're Catholic. That's what we do. So anyhow, thank you all again for being here tonight. We appreciate it. And thank you, Melissa.